Hello, everyone, and welcome to another event hosted by the Black Reconstruction as a Portal Sawyer Seminar here at the University of California, Irvine. My name is Yusuf Al-Balushi, and I teach in the Department of Global International Studies here at UCI. And we're honored today to be joined by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who will be delivering a talk titled "The Other War That Killed Reconstruction." In our year-long seminar on Black Reconstruction as a Portal, we've been exploring the global salience of visions of Black Reconstruction as a portal between the crisis that marks our current predicament and the freedom dreams of those who have taken to the streets insisting that another world is still possible. Additional upcoming seminar events next week include an in-person talk, a book talk, in fact, by Kemi Adeyemi, Feels Right, Black Queer Women and the Politics of Partying in Chicago, which will happen on Wednesday, May 24th at 4 p.m. in HG 1030 on UCI's campus. And what I believe will be our final event of the quarter will be a talk by South African scholar, activist, journalist, and editor Richard Pithouse, who will be delivering a hybrid talk on Thursday, May 25th at 2 p.m. entitled The Propaganda of the Present. Richard will also be in conversation with Rudo Mudiwa from UCI's Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies for that event. And again, that'll happen at 2 p.m. next Thursday in HG 1010, but also on Zoom for all of those who are unable to attend in person. So you can look out for more information about those events on our Twitter account at Reading Du Bois. I want to thank my comrade and co-director of the seminar, Damien Sojourner from UCI's Department of Anthropology, Melissa Valdez and Monica Rodriguez in the School of Social Sciences for all of their help organizing this event, as well as Marilyn Grell-Brisk, Temi Tope Famadou, Mariel Rowland, Amanda Swain, and Ekwa Arhin for all of their assistance with organizing this seminar. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz grew up in rural central Oklahoma, the child of a tenant farming family. She received her BA in history at San Francisco State College and the master's and PhD degrees in history at UCLA, the MFA in creative writing at Mills College, and the diploma in the International and Comparative Law of Human Rights in Strasbourg, France. She's professor emeritus at California State University, East Bay. As a veteran of the 60s revolution, she organized against the US war in Vietnam, US imperialism, racism, South African apartheid, and for workers' rights, women's liberation, and the restoration of Native American nations' lands and sovereignty, helping build Indigenous peoples' participation in United Nations fora. She received the 2015 American Book Award and the 2017 Lannan Cultural Freedom Prize. An historian, writer, and professor emeritus at California State University. She's the author or editor of 15 books, including Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico, which we were fortunate to be able to read parts of in the seminar, which I believe is also her dissertation. It's a fascinating study of land tenure and dispossession in New Mexico's many hundred years history. Also, she's the author of Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment, An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and most recently, of Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion. She's also at work on a new book of essays on Christian nationalism in the US, to be published in 2024, which we're all looking forward to. Now, in addition to all of these books, I really want to pub her 3-volume memoir. Although I don't believe they were necessarily written in chronological order, I'll present them chronologically. Volume 1 was Red Dirt, Growing Up Okie, which chronicles her youth growing up poor in rural Oklahoma in the 1940s and the 1950s. Volume 2 of her memoirs is called Outlaw Woman, a memoir of the war years, 1960 to 1975. And I think it's really the best account of Roxanne as the global left's equivalent of Kevin Bacon, which is to say, if Kevin Bacon knows everyone and has been in at least one film with practically everyone in Hollywood, then Roxanne somehow knows practically everyone in the US and global left and has somehow organized with them or come into contact with them. And the third and final volume in her memoir trilogy is Blood on the Border, a memoir of the Contra War, which chronicles her involvement with the Sandinistas, the Miskitu people of Nicaragua, and the global indigenous movement. Finally, I should also mention that she's the co-author with Orange County's own Dina Gilio Whitaker of the best-selling All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans. Our discussant today is my brilliant colleague, Fantasia Painter, who's an enrolled member and citizen of the Salt River Pima-Maricopa Indian community. She's currently an assistant professor in global and international studies at UC Irvine. Broadly, her research, most recently published in the American Indian Culture and Research Journal, aims to rethink global borders, boundaries, and migrations from indigenous worlds. Her current book project, Bordering the Nation, reveals how the border politics in southern Arizona are unfolding on O'odham indigenous lands, and argues that the US-Mexico border, like all global borders and boundaries, relies on indigenous land. She recently received the UC HSI Humanities Initiative grant for the 2022-2023 academic year from the Mellon Foundation and the UC President's Postdoctoral Fellowship Program for her contribution toward advancing and strengthening scholarship in the humanities and the humanities-inflected social sciences. So the format for today will be as follows. Roxanne will deliver a talk approximately of 40 minutes. Then we'll turn it over to Fantasia to offer some discussant remarks for 5 to 10 minutes. Fantasia will open the Q&A by posing a question or two to Roxanne, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A session with the audience. So as they're speaking, all of you in the audience, feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box, which you can see at the bottom of your Zoom window. And once we get to the Q&A session, I'll read out your questions to Roxanne once we get there. So for now, I'll turn it over to Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Joseph. And I want to thank everyone involved in the Sawyer seminar at UC Irvine. It's such a unique and important concept. And Yusuf and Damien Sojourner, especially, who are partners in directing it. And I really thank you for inviting me to contribute to the topic Black Reconstruction as a portal, engaging W.B. Du Bois' 1935 study of Black Reconstruction. I'm also very grateful to Fantasia Painter for agreeing to be in conversation with me. And thanks to everyone who is tuned in. I know 40 minutes is a long time to sit, so get up and walk around or whatever you want to do while listening, which is nice about Zoom. So the subject of the US Civil War through Reconstruction, which W.B. Du Bois dated 1860 to 1880, although it formally ended in 1776. It is the most deeply researched and written about in the annals of US history. I'm a historian, and I quit trying to count the number of books, not to speak of articles, thousands. So why Reconstruction failed with the former Confederacy implementing Jim Crow totalitarian segregation for nearly another century is rarely convincingly explained, in my opinion. And I think the elephant in the room of the query is an absence in historical narrative, including even that of the great historian W.B. Du Bois. The US Army on the eve of the Civil War was divided into 7 departments, all engaged in counterinsurgent wars against indigenous nations. and a 2-year war against Mexico, 1846 to 48. And in the process, seizing the northern half of Mexico, the problem we have on the so-called US border today, a very shaky border. Upon defeat of the Confederacy and implementation of Reconstruction, the Army occupied the states of the former Confederacy in order to implement an excellent policy of Reconstruction and political empowerment of the Black citizens. It was amazingly progressive. However, by 1870, 6 of the 7 war departments comprising 183 companies had been moved west of the Mississippi, a colonial army fighting the native nations to seize their land. That left only 1 army department to occupy the defeated Confederate states in order to enforce freedom and equality for the newly enfranchised Black citizens. In the spring of 1877, all federal troops were withdrawn and sent west, marking the end of Reconstruction, which was already terribly weakened much earlier. To explain the failure of Reconstruction with the expansion of US war making against native nations, it's important to understand that such war making took place during every phase of the Civil War itself, continuing the colonial genocide that had secured for the United States all the territory east of the Mississippi. By 1850, so-called Indian Wars, usually used in reference to the late 1800s in the Northern Plains, were in fact constant from the founding of the 13 colonies and throughout the decade of ousting the British. After nearly 3 decades of war and native resistance east of the Mississippi, under President Andrew Jackson, all native nations east of the Mississippi were forced marched from their farms, villages, and homelands to Indian territory in Oklahoma, territory that had been acquired by the United States from Napoleon in the Louisiana Purchase. Under US dominance, the so-called 5 civilized tribes indigenous to the Southeast had instituted fairly early chattel slavery of Black people. And they were allowed to take the enslaved with them to Indian territory. These were the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Muskogee, and Seminole nations. This, I'll get back to their relationship. President Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated in March 1861, 2 months after the Southern slavers had seceded from the United States as the Confederate States of America, the CSA, seizing the Army base of Fort Sumter near Charleston, South Carolina. Of more than 1,000 US Army officers, 286 left the United States Army to join the Confederacy, half of them being West Point graduates, most of them veterans of the Second and Third Wars against the Seminole Nation in Florida, as well as the 1846 invasion and annexation of the northern half of Mexico, including Robert E. Lee, who became head of the Confederate Army of Virginia. 3 of the 7 Army Department commanders took leadership of the Confederate Army. Both the Union and Confederate officers had honed their military skills in irregular warfare, that is, attacking unarmed enemy civilians, burning fields, homes, and food storage, a brutal and bloody way of war with high civilian death rates, which laid waste to the southern states as they did to Native or Mexican territories. Most non-slave owning white settlers in the South, who made up 75% of the population of the Confederate States, that is, only 25% were owned even one slave. So it was an elite. However, this 75% of poorer farmers supported and fought for the Confederacy, almost totally. Some went over to the Union forces. Abraham Lincoln's campaign for the presidency appealed to the votes of land-poor settlers who demanded that the government seize indigenous lands. They were called free soilers in reference to cheap land free of slavery. Slave bodies were the highest priced commodities on the Wall Street market at the point of the Civil War. This was where capitalism got established. New gold rushes and other incentives brought fresh waves of settlers to squat on indigenous lands. For this reason, some indigenous people preferred a Confederate victory, which might work to divide and weaken the United States, send it into chaos, which had grown ever more powerful and genocidal against the Native people. So the 5 large Native American slave-owning nations from the South, who had been forced 2 decades earlier from their homes and rich farms in the South to relocate to Oklahoma Indian Territory, were more directly involved with the Civil War than other Native nations. The Southeastern nations, the Cherokees, Muskogees, Seminoles, Choctaws, and Chickasaws, the 5 civilized tribes. And, they got that moniker mainly because they were slave owners. That's really, they didn't name themselves that. They were forcibly removed from their homelands during the Jackson administration, but in Indian Territory, they had rebuilt their townships, their farms, ranches, and institutions, including newspapers, schools, and orphanages. Although the elite citizens of each nation were wealthy and owned enslaved Africans and had elaborate and large private estates, the majority of the people continued their collective agrarian practices. The leaders of all the 5 nations signed treaties with the Confederacy, each for similar reasons. Deep resentment of the United States because of removal from their homelands and to maintain slavery. Within each nation, however, there was a clear division based on class, often misleadingly expressed as a conflict between mixed bloods and full bloods. That is, the wealthy, mixed white and assimilated slave-owning minority that dominated politics favored the Confederacy, and the non-slave-owning poor and traditional majority wanted to stay out of the Anglo-American Civil War. Historian David Chang found that the Muskogee Creek nationalism and well-founded distrust of federal power played a major role in bringing about the nation's strategic alliance, the Native nations' strategic alliance with the Confederacy. Chang writes, was the Creek-Muskogee Council's alliance with the South a racist defense of slavery and its class privileges, or was it nationalist defense of Creek lands and sovereignty? The answer has to be both. John Ross, principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, at first called for neutrality. but changed his mind for reasons similar to the Creeks, and asked the Cherokee Council for authority to negotiate a treaty with the Confederacy. Nearly 7,000 men of the 5 Native nations went into battle for the Confederacy. Stan Watie, a Cherokee, held the post of Brigadier General in the Confederate Army. His 1st Indian Brigade of the Army of the Trans-Mississippi was among the last units in the field to surrender to the Union Army on June 23rd, 1865, more than 2 months after Lee's surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Approximate Courthouse in April 1865. During the war, however, many Native Confederate volunteers became disillusioned and went over to the Union forces in abolitionist Kansas, along with enslaved African Americans who fled to freedom. This story is equally important, though less often told. A few months after the war broke out, some 10,000 men in Indian Territory, made up of Indigenous volunteers along with African Americans who had freed themselves, and even some Anglo-Americans that were poor, engaged in guerrilla warfare against the Confederate Army. They fought from Oklahoma into Kansas, where many of them joined unofficial Union units that had been organized by abolitionists who had trained with John Brown years earlier. This was not likely the kind of war the Lincoln administration had desired. A multi-ethnic volunteer union contingent fighting pro-slavery forces in Missouri, where enslaved Africans escaped to join the Union side. The self-liberation by African Americans occurring all over the South led to Lincoln's 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, which allowed freedmen to serve in combat. In the rest of the West, both Confederate and Union armies carried out wars of conquest against Native nations throughout the Civil War. In Minnesota, which had become a non-slave state a year before the Civil War began, the Dakota Sioux farmers were overwhelmed by white settlers seeking free land and were on the verge of starvation by 1862. When they mounted an uprising to drive out the mostly German and Scandinavian immigrant settlers that had appropriated their cultivated land and the rich Dakota farmlands, Union Army troops crushed the revolt, slaughtering Dakota civilians and rounding up several hundred men. Some 300 Dakota prisoners were sentenced to death. But upon Lincoln's orders to reduce the numbers, 38 were selected at random to die in the largest mass hanging in U.S. history. The Reverend Dakota leader, Little Crow, was not among those hanged, but was assassinated the following summer while out picking raspberries with his son. The assassin, a settler farmer, collected a $500 bounty from the Union Army. That would be about $5,000 now. To free the Union soldiers posted in the West to fight against the Confederate Army in the East, Lincoln called for volunteers in the West, and settlers responded, coming from Texas, Kansas, California, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Nebraska, Utah, and Nevada. Having few Confederates to fight in the West, they attacked people closer to hand, the indigenous people. Land speculators in the trans-Mississippi West sought statehood for the occupied former Mexican territories in order to attract white settlers and investors. Their eagerness to undertake ethnic cleansing of the indigenous residents to achieve the necessary population balance to attain statehood generated strong anti-Indian hysteria and violent acts. Preoccupied with the Civil War in the East, the Lincoln administration did little to prevent vicious and even genocidal actions on the part of territorial authorities consisting of volunteer Indian-hating mercenaries such as Kit Carson. The mode of maintaining settler law and order established the pattern for post-Civil War genocide against Native nations in the West. In the most infamous incident during the Civil War involving volunteer civilian militias, the 1st and 3rd Colorado Volunteers carried out the Sand Creek Massacre against unarmed Cheyenne and Arapaho. Although assigned to guard the road to Santa Fe, the volunteer units mainly engaged in raiding and looting indigenous communities. John Shivington, an ambitious politician in Colorado known as the Fighting Parson, he's also a preacher, led the 3rd Colorado Volunteers. By 1861, displaced and captive Cheyenne Arapahoes under the leadership of their great leader, Black Kettle, were incarcerated in a U.S. military reservation called Sand Creek, near Fort Lyon in southeastern Colorado. They camped under a white flag of truce and had federal permission to hunt buffalo to feed themselves. In early 1864, the Colorado territorial governor informed them that they could no longer leave the reservation to hunt. Despite their compliance with the order, although some of the young men did go out and hunt buffalo to bring food so people wouldn't starve, but generally they stayed under their white flag on the reservation. So despite their compliance, in November 1864, Shivington took 700 Colorado volunteers to the reservation. Without provocation or warning, they attacked, leaving 105 women and children and 28 men mutilated and dead. Even the Federal Commission of Indian Affairs denounced the action, saying that the people had been butchered in cold blood by troops in the service of the United States. In its 1865 investigation, the Congress Joint Committee on Conduct of the War recorded testimonies and published a report that documented the aftermath of the killings. When Shivington and his volunteers burned teepees and stole horses, worse, after the smoke had cleared, they had returned and finished off the few survivors while scalping and mutilating the corpses. Women and men, young and old, children, babies. Then they decorated their weapons and caps with body parts, fetuses, penises, breasts, and vulvas. Once back in Denver, they displayed their trophies to the adoring public in Denver Apollo Theater and in saloons. Yet despite the official detailed report of their deeds, neither Shivington nor any of his men were reprimanded or prosecuted, signaling a free field for killing. U.S. Army Colonel James Carleton formed the Volunteer Army Brigade of the Pacific in 1861, based in California. In Nevada and Utah, a California businessman, Colonel Patrick Connor, commanded a militia of 1,000 California volunteers that spent the Civil War years massacring hundreds of unarmed Shoshone, Bannock, and Ute people in their encampments. Carleton led another contingent of volunteer militias to Arizona to suppress the Apaches, who were resisting colonization, led by the great Apache leader Cochise. Following a scorched earth campaign against the Apaches, Carleton was promoted to the rank of brigadier general and placed in command of the Department of New Mexico. He brought the now seasoned killing machine of Colorado volunteers to attack the Navajos, on whom he declared total war. The Navajos were not at war with the Anglos. They were attacked. He enlisted as his principal commander in the field the ubiquitous Indian killer Kit Carson. With unlimited authority and answering to no one, Carleton spent the entire Civil War in the Southwest engaged in a series of search and destroy missions against the Navajos. The campaign culminated in March 1864 in a 300-mile forced march of some 8,000 Navajo civilians to a military concentration camp at Bosque Redonda in southeastern New Mexico desert. At the Army base of Fort Sumner, not Sumner, an ordeal recalled in Navajo oral history as the Long Walk. At least a fourth of the incarcerated Navajos died of starvation and disease. Not until 1868 were they allowed to return to their homeland in what is today the Four Corners area overlapping the territories of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. The permission to return was not based on the deadly conditions of the camp, rather that Congress determined that the incarceration was too expensive to maintain. Nor was the volunteer officer, Carleton, punished for his genocidal acts. Rather, he was appointed a major general in the U.S. Army in 1865 and head of the 4th Cavalry in scorched earth forces against the Plains Indians. These military campaigns against indigenous nations constituted foreign wars fought during the White Settler War between the northern and southern states. With the abrupt end of Reconstruction, the whole U.S. Army carried out genocidal wars against Native tribes to 1890, with added killing technology and more seasoned killers, including African-American cavalry units. Demobilized officers and soldiers often could not find jobs after the war, and along with a new generation of young settlers, otherwise unemployed and often seeking adventure, they joined the Army of the West. Some of the officers accepting lower ranks in order to get career Army assignments. But given that the war was centered in the West, and the military achievement had come to foster prestige, wealth, and political power, every West Point graduate sought to further his career by volunteering in the Army. Some of their diaries echo those of combat troops in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, who were troubled by the atrocities they witnessed or committed. But most soldiers persevered in their ambition and to succeed for promotions. Early during Reconstruction, when the U.S. Army was a significant occupying force in the former Confederate states, Black Republicans were elected to state and local offices and attempted to reform the all-white local and state militias, requiring males to serve regardless of race. Few Anglo-Americans were willing to serve with Black people. But African Americans did serve in the state militias, as well as founding their own local volunteer militia groups. Former slavers spread rumors that Black people were forming insurrectionist armies to murder white people, just white individuals. Former slavers created armed gangs to intimidate other white farmers and merchants who traded with Black farmers and artisans. The threats and acts of violence often putting white merchants out of business. Most ominously, white Southerners formed volunteer militias under the guise of private rifle clubs. By 1876, South Carolina alone had more than 240 such clubs. This allowed thousands of Confederate combat veterans, along with the former Confederate guerrillas, to mobilize quickly. The Ku Klux Klan was the most violent syndicate, its purpose being to subdue the Black population and to exploit their labor. Either by their absence in many places or by their actions in others, some of the U.S. Army officers in charge of the occupation of the South or Reconstruction made these failures of Reconstruction possible. One character who stands out, but is also representative, is Union Army General Edward R.S. Canby, a Kentuckian who was the post-war Army occupation commander of North and South Carolina. Canby refused to use the soldiers under his command to enforce the new laws, and instead relied on white Southern law enforcement to maintain order, which of course they didn't do, and Canby had to have known what would happen. Like many of U.S. Civil War commanders assigned to this occupation army of the former Confederacy, Canby was reassigned in 1872 to the Army of the West, where he commanded troops to round up several Modoc Nation families in Northern California who refused to be forced onto an Oregon reservation. The Modocs waged a year-long resistance to the U.S. Army. Their brutal counterinsurgency of the Army finally actually killing General Canby, the only general ever killed by Native people. And they were sorely punished for it, all of them hung. But by 1870, 6 of the 7 divisions of the U.S. Army had been stationed at St. Louis and the outpost for the Army of the West. And this was a central factor that had the U.S. pulling troops out of the South too early, prematurely, to lead or fight in the dozens of wars the United States was initiating against indigenous nations in the Northern Plains, Southwest, Intermountain West, and California. And these were all led by former Union Army level officers, including William Tecumseh Sherman, Philip H. Sheridan, George Crook, Nelson Miles, George Armstrong Custer. Undoubtedly, ingrained white supremacy among the white Army officers contributed to their poor performance as enforcers of desegregation, as well as committed killers of Native people who were blocking U.S. manifest destiny, so-called, in control of the continent, that after which the world. During Reconstruction, the Army would make effective use of, after 1865, of innovations created during the Civil War to destroy the resistance of Native nations in the West. The rapid-fire Gatling gun, first used in the Civil War Battle of 1862, would be employed during the rest of the century against Indigenous civilians, as well as the innovative Winchester rifle. Non-technological innovations were perhaps even more important. The Civil War having fostered an extreme patriotic ideology in the Union Army that carried over into the Indian Wars. Now more centralized under presidential command, U.S. forces relied less on state contributions and were thus less subject to their control. The prestige of the Department of War rose within the federal government so that it had far more leeway to send troops to steamroll over Indigenous peoples who resisted U.S. colonization. As noted before, the end of the Civil War, the U.S. Army hardly missed a beat before the war when the West began in full force. As far more advanced killing machines and with seasoned troops, the Army began the slaughter of people, buffalo, and the land itself, destroying the natural tall grasses of the plains, with white settlers planting short grasses for cattle, eventually leading to the loss of the topsoil 4 decades later in fierce dust storms. William Tecumseh Sherman, famous for burning Atlanta, came out of the Civil War a major general and soon commanded the U.S. Army, replacing war hero Ulysses S. Grant when Grant became president in 1869. As commanding general throughout 1883, Sherman was responsible for the genocidal wars against the resistant Indigenous nations of the West. Sherman's family was among the first generation of settlers after the War of Independence, who rushed to the Ohio Valley region after the total war that drove the people of the Shawnee Nation out of their homes, towns, and farms. Sherman's father gave his son the trophy name Tecumseh after the great Shawnee leader who was killed by the U.S. Army. The general had been a successful lawyer and banker in San Francisco and New York before he turned to a military career. During the Civil War, most famously in the Siege of Atlanta, he made his mark as a proponent and practitioner of total war, scorched earth campaigns against civilians, particularly targeting food supplies. This had long been the colonial and U.S. American way of war against the Indigenous peoples east of the Mississippi. Sherman sent an army commission to England to study English colonial campaigns worldwide, looking to employ successful English tactics for the U.S. wars against Indigenous peoples. In Washington, Sherman had to contend with the upper echelons of the military and were under the sway of Karl von Clausewitz's book on war, which dealt with conflict between European nation states and standing armies. This dichotomy of training the U.S. military for standard European warfare, but also training it for combat counterinsurgency methods, guerrilla warfare, continues in the 21st century with undeclared wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Although a man of war, Sherman, like most U.S. ruling class, was an entrepreneur at heart. And his mandate as head of the army and was to protect the Anglo conquest of the West, to move on to conquer China, the Chinese trade. Sherman regarded railroads as a top priority in building the nation's capitalist system. Sherman brought in His most notorious avatar, George Armstrong Custer, who's probably best known for his army getting totally destroyed by the Lakotas in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. But Custer proved his mettle right away before he was destroyed by leading an attack on unarmed civilians in November 27th, 1868, at the Southern Cheyenne Reservation in Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma, at Washita Creek. Earlier, at the Colorado Volunteers 1864 Sand Creek Massacre, the Cheyenne leader, Black Kettle, whom I mentioned before, had actually escaped with his family, and he and other Chinese survivors were then forced to leave Colorado Territory for a reservation in Indian Territory. Some young Cheyenne men, determined to resist reservation confinement and hunger, decided to hunt and to fight back with guerrilla tactics. Since the army was rarely able to capture them, Custer resorted to total counterinsurgent warfare, murdering the incarcerated mothers, wives, children, and elders. When Black Kettle received word from indigenous spies within the army ranks that the mounted troops of the 7th Cavalry were leaving their fort and headed for the Washita Reservation, he and his wife rode out at dawn in a snowstorm, unarmed, with a white flag, to attempt to talk with Custer and assure him that no armed resistors were present in the reservation. Upon Black Kettle and his wife approaching with their white flag approaching Custer's army, Custer ordered the soldiers to fire, and a moment later, Black Kettle and his wife lay dead in the snow. All told, the 7th Cavalry massacred over 100 Cheyenne women and children that day, taking ghoulish trophies afterward. In the annals of U.S. warfare, this is called officially the Battle of the Washita. A few years later, in 1876, Custer's regiment was decimated by the Lakotas at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Custer was righteously killed. Many of the intensive genocidal campaigns against indigenous civilians took place during the presidency of Civil War General Ulysses S. Grant, 1869 to 77. In 1866, Congress had created 2 all-African cavalry regiments that came to be called Buffalo Soldiers, some of them by the Lakotas, not at all an insult, as the bison was the most sacred animal, and Dakotas thought the bearded Black soldiers resembled the buffalo's face. Some 4 million former enslaved men were free U.S. citizens in 1865. Now, many African-American men, especially young men, had freed themselves during the war by fleeing servitude and joining Union forces or forming their own militias. And up to 1862, Black men had been barred from serving in their own capacity in the Army. Now the Union Army incorporated them at lower pay, to be sure, and in segregated units under white officers. The War Department created the Federal Bureau of Colored Troops, and 100,000 armed African Americans served in the unit. Their courage and commitment made them the best and most effective fighters, although they had the highest mortality rate. At the end of the Civil War, 186,000 Black soldiers had fought and 38,000 had died in combat and from disease, a higher death toll than that of any individual state. The state with the highest casualty count was New York, with troops comprising mostly poor white immigrant soldiers, largely Irish immigrants. After the war, many Black soldiers, like their poor white counterparts, remained in the Army and were assigned to segregated regiments sent west to crush indigenous resistance. The Buffalo Soldiers were formidable fighters. Many freedmen opted for Army service for survival reasons, as it gave them food and shelter, pay and pension, and even some glory, as well as land grants in Indian Territory, Oklahoma, after the Native Nations estates were subjected to allotment and privatized, in part as punishment for their support for the Confederacy. The United States had its own motives for assigning Black troops to the West. Southerners and Eastern population did not want thousands of armed, battle-ready Black soldiers in their communities. There was also fear that the demobilized the labor market would be flooded by them. For U.S. authorities, it was a good way of getting rid of both the Black soldiers and the Indians. The explicit purpose of the Buffalo Soldiers and the Army of the West as a whole was to invade indigenous lands and ethnically cleanse them for Anglo settlement and commerce. As Native historian Jace Weaver has written, the Indian Wars were not fought by the blindingly white American cavalry of John Ford Westerns and many historical texts, I would add, but by African Americans and Irish and German immigrants, unquote. The haunting Bob Marley song, Buffalo Soldier, captures the colonial experience of the United States. Said he was a Buffalo Soldier, win the war for America, America with a K. Over 100 military campaigns against Native peoples were fought during the Civil War and Reconstruction. The period of Reconstruction formally ended in 1880, but had been drained for a decade of effectiveness with the Army of the West. While U.S. wars against natives continued for another decade, in 1879, U.S. policy of assimilation of Native Americans began with the military establishment of the first federally run Indian boarding school at the Carlisle, Pennsylvania Army base, establishing the Indian Industrial School. Other boarding schools for natives forcibly removed from their homes when they were young children were established around the country. Armed Native resistance continued, but the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre marked the end. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't go over my time.
No, that was great. Thank you, Roxanne. We will now turn it over to Dr. Fantasia Painter for discussant remarks.
Okay, well, first of all, I just think I have to give you a round of applause. I think that's part of the tricky part of Zoom, is that you don't get to hear the cacophony of appreciation at the end. And so I'll just give you a solo round of applause and just say, thank you so much for this incredible and disturbing and really serious and grave accounting of these what I would have called parallel histories, but which I think you compellingly argue are not parallel histories of Reconstruction and the so-called closing of the frontier. And that last one being a euphemism that I think you really show is a euphemism for all-out scorched earth, total counterinsurgent warfare against Indigenous people. And so I will start my timer because Dr. Al-Balushi told me not to go over time, and so I won't. But I do have, I do have some thoughts. I took like so many notes, and so please excuse any disjunction. But I'll just go ahead. I think in this talk, you do such an amazing job for us, like I said, adumbrating these, what we would have called parallel histories of Reconstruction and the so-called closing of the frontier. And you do it in a really artful way. It's absolutely not surprising that you've written so many books and you just continue to go on book tours and get published. Like, you're such a compelling writer. And you focus on these meta processes, and then you also ground it in really rich, horrifying detail. So for example, you talk about on December 26th, 1862 was the hanging of the Dakota Eight. Just a few days later, on January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln established the Emancipation Proclamation. You demonstrate for us how the Civil War, that the US Army hardly missed a beat, I think was your phrase, before the war to win the West began in full force. And you show us how officials are actually pulling out officers from the South and the North and putting them in the West. And you're talking about all of these pieces that come together to really mean violence on Native people. And even after that, you say, in practice, demobilized officers and soldiers often could not find jobs after the war. They joined the Army of the West. And you say there were poor enforcers of desegregation and committed killers of Native people. And just the weight of that idea and phrasing, I'm going to be sitting with that for quite some time. And then I really appreciate the ways that you are giving us names. You're naming names here of individuals who, if not under auspices of the US, then were certainly not condemned by it in their violence against Native people. You talk about William Tecumseh Sherman, Nelson Miles, George Armstrong Custer. And I wish, after hearing your talk, I have this T-shirt that I wear sometimes in class. Some of my students are here. Hello, friends. And it says, it's a quote from George Custer. It says, "There are not enough Indians in the world to defeat the 7th Cavalry," right? And so he died in the Battle of Little Bighorn on June 25th, 1876. So there's like these funny moments, but you are also talking about numbers, right? Numbers of killed men, women, and children. You talk about war trophies. Yeah, and the fact that none of these men were punished, and in fact, it was quite the opposite. And so I'm struck by the cacophony of violence, but it's in service to this argument that, again, I find quite compelling, that the post-Civil War genocide against Native nations was contingent on Civil War actions, right? That these are so implicated and so intricately related. You say the mode of maintaining settler law and order established the pattern for post-Civil War genocide against Native nations. Okay. You then tell us about James Carleton, who formed the Volunteer Army of the Pacific in 1861, based here in California. You say he hooks up with Kit Carlson and that they worked with unlimited authority, answering to no one. So thinking about that juxtaposition between law and order and just absolute settler violence. You talk about the Long Walk in 1864, the Sand Creek Massacre as well. And you introduce us to Edward Canby, the Kentuckian, who you say refused to enforce these new laws, who's loyal to white Southern law, and is assigned to the Army of the West. So what does law and order look like in these contexts? You take a minute to draw attention to the technology, to the Gatling gun and the Winchester the rifle. William Tecumseh Sherman mentions his investment in the railroad that justified total war against Native people. What, if I can be a little nerdy for a second here, what this talk really made me think about too was just, I think I keep saying it, right? I'm excited, it's repeating for me, is this role of law and order and policing and what that looks like. You talk about the Sand Creek Massacre and how it's related and implicated in the reservation as a system of enclosure and incarceration, even though the US government would find that to be too costly over time. That also makes me think about the establishment of Indian police, which would happen just 5 years later, right? In 1869, Thomas Lightfoot, the US Indian agent to the Iowa and the Second Fox tribes in Nebraska, became the first to report and presumably establish a federally sponsored Indian police. San Carlos is shortly after, wherein Superintendent John Clum hires 4 Apaches at $15 a month, which is that's no small potatoes, to act as an Indian police. We then have, and this is just, these are things I'm bringing on the outside, of course. I will get to a question. So then we have like the ways that Congress appropriates funds for the first time for an Indian police in 1879, establishes a code of police rules. And then by 1881, I was reading 49 out of 68 agencies had these police. In 1883, we get rules for the courts of Indian offenses. And in 1885, we get the Major Crimes Act. And so I guess what I'm saying is what your talk really made me think about is how these systems are established, how and in what context these systems are established. I think Paul Harris, a geographer, wrote this piece in 2004 that says we have to be focused on how colonialism dispossesses. And he talks about really land and allotment. I think that your talk is demonstrating the actual absolute violence and putting it all in a row for us in ways that are deeply unsettling, right? If I can kind of play on this settler colonial project to forget, that are deeply unsettling and remind us what's at the core of colonization. So I think you take time to think about what Black and poor white soldiers, right, how they get conscripted into this process, without losing focus on what is an overarching state-sponsored or at least ignored process, right? That the state that the United States government is encouraging by not punishing too. The question I wanted to open up with was to just give you, I could listen to you talk forever, and I think everybody in this room feels the same way. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity maybe to take a step sideways from this data-rich thing that you've given us and to just maybe take a moment to articulate what you are seeing as the relationship between racial capitalism or all capitalism and settler colonialism in this moment. And that is the question I'm going to open with. And again, thank you so much. We're so excited to have you. What an incredible talk. Yeah, I'll stop talking now. I think I'm good.
Oh, thank you so much for those comments that really clarified to me what I was trying to say. And yeah, I wanted to the Indian police. I'm glad you brought that up because Sitting Bull was assassinated killed by Indian police. And Sitting Bull was unarmed, sitting on his porch. So that's one of the more tragic stories of what the Indian police did. Of course, that was in 1890. Racial capitalism is something I kind of referred to capitalism, but it's kind of in all my work, kind of central theme of it's actually the world's development. I mean, how the United States came to start to say conquer, but actually, control the world, not just by, warships and military, but by capitalism. And, there's a whole lot of work that's come out in the last decade about those who are, specialists in like Walter Johnson in the, in the South, and that has really changed our understanding of the world's development of capitalism. It's always thought it was, really came to fruition and development and was patterned after the factory work in after the closing of the commons in Great Britain and England, and that was one site, and that made the British very rich, and of course they controlled almost the full world at one time. But the United States capital developed even really earlier in the 1830s and 1840s. It's always dated in the the 70s and 80s with industrial, but slavery was it seems like it's contradictory to have capitalism and slavery. This is what Marx said. This don't go together because slavery is medieval, but he was wrong about that. I mean, I love Marx, but he's wrong about that, because this was, Walter Johnson, his River of Dark Dreams, I think, lays it out the most brilliantly of exactly the capital of the United States was based in the South, based on cotton. And it was international, shipping the cotton out to those factories in England and also in New England to make goods. And so it was and so you reconceive of the Black body, of the enslaved person as a commodity, not just super exploited labor, of course, but as the most valuable commodity. Now, what does that say about capitalism? That its most valued commodity are Black bodies bought and sold on the auction block. That was the main, in Wall Street and in the banks of New York, that was the main commodity bought and sold in the 1840s. So I think that's really, racial capitalism is its limitation. What I try to do and what I think is so important is that it's not a matter of, say, oppression Olympics, as my mentor Elizabeth Martinez used to say, we're not doing oppression Olympics. She was Chicana, between different ethnic groups, oppressed ethnic groups. It's a matter of getting it straight. How has the United States come to be as it is? And there's so many false narratives about the United States, and then these divisions between peoples who's more oppressed, the genocide against Indians, or what I consider genocide against Africans, and shipping them over. They were deprived of their homes. They were relocated, very much like Native people relocated. So there's so many similarities, but because we don't have this analysis, we don't have this kind of solidarity that's interrelated, and so everything then becomes a kind of cultural, kind of fake cultural. I have nothing against, cultural, but if it's not deeply embedded in the economics and politics, then it's it's just oppression Olympics.
Thank you for teaching me that phrase, the oppression Olympics.
I know. Very
No,
good phrase.
your mentors, yeah, absolutely. And I think you just do such a good job of demonstrating how these things are co-constituted and really the condition of a possibility for each other. And so thank you for that answer. And then with that, I think I'm going to pass it over to Yusuf. I think I've done my duties. I didn't go over my time. And so I just want to say thank you again, Roxanne. I really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Oh, that was great. Thank you very much, Fantasia. And thank you, Roxanne, for that talk. So we're opening up now the conversation to a Q&A with everyone. And I see people are posting their questions in the Q&A box. Please continue to do that. That would be great. And we'll take the first question here from John Wessel McCoy, who says, at the end of his chapter, Counter-Revolution of Property, Du Bois says, quote, and the rebuilding, whether it comes now or a century later, will and must go back to the principles of Reconstruction in the United States during 1867 to 1876. Land, light, and leading for slaves, black, brown, yellow, and white. End quote. Given the challenge of putting the whole story together in relation to Indigenous peoples' history, what do you still unite with in Du Bois's statement?
I think that's absolutely right. The Reconstruction program was amazingly progressive for the time. And I do think, I give credit to the Black and white abolitionist movement for conceptualizing a developed South. I mean, it was the center of capitalism, but a developed South that actually had communal aspects to it, not just simply individual plots, say land grants or something, but schools that and a lot got done during Reconstruction. But I do think it was brilliantly conceived, and that it was in some ways no accident, or that the political elite, the power entities of the United States did not want that to really happen. It wasn't, the Ku Klux Klan at one time, when they had withdrawn 6 of the 7 units of the army, and it was left, very spread out. One officer said in South Carolina alone that it would take the whole 7 regiments of the U.S. Army to overcome the power of the Ku Klux Klan. It was huge, Now, how that didn't happen just automatically, and that I really think that the abolitionists and those who designed of the Reconstruction policy were very sincere, but those who were to implement it, I think, really did not want that much Black power in their continent. They're terrified of Haiti. They're, tried to destroyed at every chance they could get. And so I do think that that's a really important question. And I think Du Bois was really onto something, understanding this was no, it wasn't just now you're free and you can do this and that. There was really, really thought out plans for Reconstruction. And it's just a tragedy of human history, I think, that setback and that drive for empire that, to take the continent. It wasn't just killing Indians for fun. It was to take the land, for one thing, for land sales. The South was the powerhouse. It was the capitalist, seat of the United States at the Civil War. And so what the United States had built power on was land sales, taking from Indians and selling land and recruiting settlers. I mean, literally going over and dropping leaflets in the Scandinavian countries that were very poor at that time. They didn't really want anyone but white people, with Scandinavians or Western Europeans, Irish, and because they needed that labor, and they needed people to buy land, cheap, very cheap land taken from Indians. And during the administration of Lincoln, he set up, the whole land, allotment, selling allotments, and they were so busy doing these other things during the Civil War that's rarely ever talked about. But I think Du Bois had an insight into how this planning for the South was not really a fear of the reemergence of the Confederacy, which happened, but really not altogether wanting, Black power.
Thanks, Roxanne. We have two questions, both kind of about Oklahoma. So I thought I'll pose them together. And these are all great questions, so please keep them coming. Audience members, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box. So the first of these two questions, which we'll pose together, comes from Upuli de Silva, who says, "Thank you so much for this. I'm asking this question to you as an Okie from an Okie. I found the national imaginary of Tulsa and Oklahoma an interesting mirror of broader racial politics in the US. I find it difficult to articulate, but do you have any thoughts on the relationship between the settler panic over McGirt, implying that almost all of Tulsa is still Native jurisdiction, and the renewed attention to Black Wall Street and the race massacre that took place on the same land?" So that's the first question from Upuli. The second question comes from our comrade, Dr. David Anthony, historian at UC Santa Cruz, who says, "Could you talk about the Dawes Act, what it was, how it came about, and what effects it had upon Native nations and Afro-Natives, especially freed people in Indian Territory, Oklahoma?" So I hope it makes sense that I posed those together, Roxanne.
Yeah, the Tulsa race riot, it was, it was very interesting that it wasn't the only place. There were 3 or 4 Black cities that got, wiped out like that during that time, but definitely Black Tulsa was an amazing thing. But one of the things that allowed these Black people in the Tulsa region, this is Creek territory. And of course it was, I mentioned allotment, it had been allotted, but those grants I was talking about that blacks who fought in the army and all, could get in Indian territory, they took them. And so these were people who had a lot of confidence in themselves. They had been slaves of the 5 civilized nations, and now they were the ones who, kind of that became very divided too, by race within the nations. They didn't fully get their, well, the Cherokees only a few years ago, like Cherokees got the full right to vote and be citizens, and it took a Supreme Court decision and a threat from the Black Congressional Congress to defund the Cherokee Nation completely if they didn't, implement this. But they had a great deal of confidence because they had freed themselves. And Indian Territory was very specific, and they had fought, in their own, and with white people. As I said, that amazing little told story about just these militias they formed to fight slavery, to fight the Confederacy on their own, and they're very independent. So I think that success, it was the biggest success in Oklahoma, before the oil strikes and all, when Oklahoma City and Tulsa became so wealthy, that there was a jealousy and a resentment. And of course, it was the period of the second Ku Klux Klan that was kind of artificially remade by the Wilson administration, to fight the commies, the socialists, and the do things like destroy Black Tulsa. But I think they're very the person who from Tulsa probably understands that, how really self-confident the Black Oklahomans are, not just in Tulsa but in all of eastern Oklahoma. Boley is a famous town, Black town. They formed Black towns, so these Black townships all over, and a Black college, Langston University, all Black college they formed. So they really had this opportunity, part of it being that it was territory, and that they weren't within the Confederacy. So let's see, that's the trouble when I get 2 questions, I forget the second one.
No problem. I can repeat the second one for you. It was basically asking you to talk.
I got it.
Yeah.
The Dawes Act. Okay.
That's right.
Yeah, the Dawes Act. This was to break down the Indian estates, the native estates of the whole swaths of communal land that was unequal. As I said, there had been slave owners, and there still was an elite among Native people, but it was and the historian Angie DeBow is the great authority on this, on her book, The 5 Civilized Tribes, and the corruption, involved in allotment. They drew up a list of Native people, and this Dawes list, the Dawes, it was the Dawes Act, named after Senator Dawes, to divide it all up so that, as he put it, Indians could come to be basically white people and capitalists. He actually said capitalists, that there's nothing more advanced than the capitalist rule. And but it was just the Dawes Act was supposed to sign up who were the Native people. But so many of the Native people, the poorer people, the people who were, well off and still lived in their communities, didn't speak English, they spoke their own languages, or they spoke very little English and were not, were pretty insular. And some lived up in the hills, and they didn't have very good communications. There were, no phones or anything to let them know, and they certainly didn't bother to really find everyone to say, they didn't go out, saying, trying to sign people up as whoever came forward. So many people came forward who had allotments but were not Native people. Famously, Will Rogers, that got Native status, but they weren't natives at all. So this is still, it's still a problem in Oklahoma. And just take our governor there, Stitt, who's Cherokee. He's just like DeSantis, and somewhat like Trump. But it was a corrupt operation, and it was meant to be that way. And so many Native people were disenfranchised. And the there's been so much written about the Osage, the corruption, the Osage Nation, and the deaths and everything, and people marrying, white men marrying into, so they could get allotments. And so it remains one of the reasons that Oklahoma is one of the poorest states in the country and one of the most corrupt. And on top of that, of course, the oil. In fact, the oil was, discovered in the 1880s, and the Dawes Act was a kind of, also people who got land then got the royalties of the oil that came out from that. So it was definitely a free for all, and it affected Black people because they also, had allotments, and they lost. They had Indian allotments. I think I was going to say they had Creek. The Creek land after the Civil War. They got land equal, with the Indians, and they had allotments. So putting those together to make Black Tulsa was, they had a land base which most Black people didn't, after the Civil War.
Thank you, Roxanne. We have a question from Cedar Monroe, who asks, did the abolitionist movement oppose the wars in the West against Indigenous people in any significant way during Reconstruction?
I so admire the abolitionists. I at one time had started my dissertation on abolitionists. I admired them so much, especially the women. And I ended up writing on land tenure in New Mexico. A long story. Had to change chairman. But I did, do a lot of research for this. I think even in high school, reading assigned the American political tradition, Hofstadter's book, he had, there was a thing about about one of the abolitionists. I think that got me interested at that time. And I think they truly were, except especially John Brown, really, really not racist. That's hard to imagine at that time. White people who were not racist. They're very special people. I mean, not all abolitionists. Some wanted separation. Some wanted, they call Alexander Hamilton an abolitionist. He was no abolitionist. He wanted to ship Black people to Africa, get rid of them. I don't call that abolitionism. It's abolishing people. It's not abolishing slavery. So the real abolitionists, John Brown being the most radical, and he was supported. He was supported by. I think they thought, definitely it wouldn't succeed, but it was, as Melville wrote, the comet that produced the Civil War earlier than it would have. So there were differences, I think Frederick Douglass was, of course, predominant. He traveled the world, he traveled. When I was doing my last book on the chapter on Irish immigration, there I found, okay, Frederick Douglass is right there in Ireland, talking about colonialism. So he was an amazing person. And of course, his 3 different autobiographies were bestsellers and very powerful. But I think they really, the main ones, the movers and shakers, they were very driven, the white ones, that they hated slavery. They really, really did. And part of it was a Christian, some of it was Christian abolitionism, but most of it was, just political, that it was immoral, it was just wrong. So I don't think, I think slavery would have gone on a lot longer had it not been for John Brown's Act and the pressure put on the Confederate States. The Bronte sisters from South Carolina, abolitionists, just the fact they're in a slave-owning family and they're among the most radical of the abolitionists. So I think they're some of our greatest heroes, and that they certainly sped up the Civil War. And I think that the ones who lived on, of course, Frederick Douglass, he was back at the Chicago Columbian thing in 1992. He's lived on a long time. And he was very crushed, I think, by the backlash, the just stopping Reconstruction and everything going backwards, they felt like great failure, somewhat like my generation feels the situation now, how we failed in the 60s, all of our exhausting actions and death and, imprisonments and all that, that here we are like this. So I can really identify with how the abolitionists felt with the change, but they were definitely, it was very hard for the slaves to free themselves. They were really trying to, that some actually visited Haiti, during the Haitian Revolution. And and they had uprisings, and it could be that, but they were a large group of people, enslaved people, but they were a minority. It was very hard with a sealed, the water all around. To escape, many did. They went to the Mexican border, over into Mexico. There were settlements of African Americans in Mexico. Some went to Haiti, but that didn't help, and there were a lot of marooners, in Louisiana and Mississippi, and in the Great Dismal Swamp in South Carolina. So I think not enough attention and tribute goes to, slaves freeing themselves as abolitionists. I think, there's a little bit of a weight of white abolitionists without that history of Black resistance.
Great. Yeah, I think it's been really nice to see a number of these questions picking up on the question of resistance and kind of multiracial resistance, solidarity, how to build a coalition in this historical moment. And of course, that is one of the great things about Du Bois's book, Black Reconstruction, is that he's really thinking centrally about this history as a moment of class struggle, but as a moment of class struggle that, as Fantasia, I think, was arguing in reflecting on your talk, centers capitalism as always racial capitalism, and therefore class as something always cross-cut by race, and fully infused by race, especially in the context of the US, but also globally. So, but also what's so impressive about Du Bois's study is that in an attempt to retrospectively think about the possibilities and ultimate kind of foreclosure of class struggle in this moment, he's careful to kind of connect the different class groups and subgroups to their material interests, or at times to what they perceive or misperceive to be their material interests. And so I think we have one more question that I think has that in mind as part of the background. We have time for one more question, and then I know we've really taken up a lot of your time, but this has been a fascinating conversation. And this question comes from Marilyn Grell-Brisk, and she says, thank you so much for your incredibly informative talk, making clear the relational histories of the failures of Reconstruction and the continued domestic warfare, and indeed the genocidal action against Native populations. In the spirit of thinking through this, could you talk a bit about the various interests, and then in parentheses she puts Native slave owners, the Native non-slave owners, the Confederacy, the US government, free Black people, poor whites, etc. So talk a bit about these various interests at work in the decisions to join the war or not, to engage fully in Reconstruction or not, and the various possibilities for collaboration that did or did not work. So it's a big question, but I think I read it in parallel to kind of how Du Bois's own reading of Black Reconstruction assessed the possibilities of class struggle across these varied interest groups.
Yeah, it's Du Bois was really pioneer, and stands out as someone grappling with where does class fit in. Fortunately, he was cognizant of that, and I think there are other situations. I think of my own grandfather, who was a Scots-Irish settler of the family originally, the Dunbar family originally from Appalachia and, ended up in Oklahoma, where my dad was born, that he became a socialist. He's a veterinarian and a landowner. And where I grew up, the town where I grew up. And he became a socialist, and the socialists in Oklahoma, when, in 1906 or so to 1907 to 1922, when they were wiped out by the Wilson administration, they and the Ku Klux Klan, they had this out in eastern Oklahoma, the farmers had small plots. They were very, very poor. They were Black, Indian, and white, on their allotments. And the socialists went out and helped organize them. And they actually kind of went further than the socialists had envisioned, armed themselves, and decided to kill, that they were going to all of them get together and overthrow the landlords, because they were tenant farmers, they were sharecroppers, like my father became. And of course, they got put down by, huge horde of town fathers in the area, but they actually, John Womack Jr. at Harvard University History has written about this, articles. He and I did a thing in Monthly Review, so I really recommend it, because it was an effort to bring together, these elements. It was a moment where you could see it's the possibilities of that it could happen again, this kind of class, interracial class moment that we need to find a way to keep going, and not get defeated over and over again. But we have those moments in history that, as the person asking this question, that are important moments that just because they failed, just because Reconstruction failed, we don't need to look at it closely as a model for what can be done, because it's so deep, it's so deep back to the 1840s, that it was building up what people, abolitionists saw, the radical abolitionists saw as a future of interracial class solidarity and a different kind of country than what we have. And I think defeat is really disheartening, and I think it's also, as we saw, say, with the Black Power movement in the 60s and 70s, and the American Indian movement, this smashing, absolutely imprisoning and killing, that talk about dispassionate, taking all the leaders away. And this was, of course, during the Indian Wars as well, targeting the spiritual people, for instance, like Sitting Bull. He was not a warrior, he wasn't a chief or anything like that. He was the religious leader. And they did that, and they, when they took over, when they would occupy Indian territories, they'd burn all the sacred items, the things that were used to communicate with with their, what they believed in, their spirituality, so that they did the ghost dance, and then that was the Wounded Knee Massacre, just because they were dancing. They had everything taken away from them, so they're massacred for dancing. And all it took was, just it was nothing. It was just a shirt. Nothing that could hurt the soldiers. And then, the same thing with the with all of the massacres, just destroying everything. But what they did, the Plains Indians, is form the Native American Church, the peyote cult. And that's, really have kind of their portal for keeping their spirituality. There were no items, nothing to be destroyed. It was just a tent. You could just, make another tent. And so how people persist in resistance. So I do think, there are lessons here we can gain for ourselves of what you're doing, with the Reconstruction topic, because it is the most thoroughly revolutionary era, truly revolutionary era of U.S. history. And it's not really presented at that. It's a little boring in history texts. I don't think students get very interested. So I hand it to you all for, for giving it its due.
Well, thank you, Roxanne. We really appreciate that. And we really couldn't have imagined, as Fantasia said, a better, more nuanced kind of relational history, building off of Du Bois's work and extending it to the centrality of these wars of conquest and genocide in the West, and how these histories are all connected in really interesting but important ways for us to think about as we think about political struggle today. So thank you very much for a fantastic talk. And thank you, Fantasia, also for your wonderful remarks. And thanks to our audience for a really wonderful set of questions, for attending. Please stay in touch. We have a couple more events next week to close out the seminar, but thank you, everyone. We really appreciate it.